There's a moment, just before the world explodes, that's quieter than anything you've ever known. I want you to come with me to that moment. It's 0330 hours, September 9th, 1943. You're in the cold, dark belly of a Higgins boat, a flat-bottomed steel coffin pitching in the gentle swell of the Gulf of Salerno. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fumes, salt spray, and the nervous sweat of 30 men who've been told they're about to punch a hole straight through Hitler's fortress Europe. Our human anchor in this sea of history is a man named Sergeant Frank Costello of the 36th Infantry Division. He's not a general, not a strategist. He's a former ranch hand from Texas who spent the last year turning boys into soldiers. He knows the weight of every rifle, the name of every man's sweetheart, and the precise sound a helmet makes when it clinks against the steel ramp. He believes in the plan. He has to. The plan, as explained by a smooth-faced lieutenant with a map and a pointer, was beautiful in its simplicity. They called it Operation Avalanche. The name itself promised overwhelming force. Churchill had called Italy the soft underbelly of the Axis, a phrase so poetic it felt like a guarantee. Just hours ago, news had crackled over the radio that Italy had surrendered. The men had cheered. They were told they'd be fighting demoralized Italian coastal garrisons, maybe a few second-rate German units left behind in the confusion. It was supposed to be a walk-in. Costello runs a whetstone over his bayonet one last time. The SHHHG sound a small prayer against the thrum of the engine. He looks at the faces of his men, pale and young in the darkness. They're scared, but they're ready. Ready for what the maps promised. Then comes the change. The deep, thunderous boom of the naval bombardment, the big guns from the battleships and cruisers offshore that have been pounding the coast for an hour suddenly stops. And the silence that follows is wrong. It's not the silence of a defeated enemy. It's a heavy, listening silence. A predator's silence. The boat grinds against sand. The coxswain screams, 30 seconds. Costello feels a cold knot tighten in his gut. This doesn't feel like a soft underbelly. It feels like teeth. Ramp down. The steel gate crashes into the water with a colossal splash, and the night is torn open not by scattered, panicked rifle fire, but by a symphony of methodical German destruction. White flares pop high overhead, bathing the beach in a ghostly, chemical daylight. And in that light, Costello sees it. The plan is a lie. The beach isn't defended by a few machine gun nests. It's a kill zone. Every dune, every stone house, every gentle rise overlooking the sand has been perfectly sighted by German artillery. The high ground, which they were supposed to seize before breakfast, is already spitting fire down their throats. The first shell, an 88mm airburst, explodes directly over the boat next to them, a sound like God slamming a door. Men simply vanish in a red mist. Then comes a sound none of them were prepared for, the sound of an MG-42 machine gun, Hitler's buzzsaw, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. It doesn't sound like a gun. It sounds like canvas being ripped in half, a sound that shreds the air and the men caught in it. Costello screams, "Go! Go! Go!" But his voice is swallowed by the chaos. His men plunge into the waist-deep water, into a perfectly calibrated meat grinder. The plan promised a quick dash across the sand. The reality is a desperate crawl for survival against an enemy who seems to have been waiting for them with a marked calendar and a freshly drawn map. The grand strategy of the Allied High Command, the confident lines drawn on maps in Algiers and London, meant nothing here. All that mattered was the 100 yards of sand between the water and the first shallow ditch. For Sergeant Costello and the men of the Fifth Army, the war in Italy had just begun, and the first lesson was being written in blood on the shores of Salerno. The plan, so clean and logical, had just collided with a brutal, unforeseen reality. And as Costello lay pressed into the wet sand, the tide turning red around him, a single, terrifying question burned through the fog of war, a question that would come to define the entire Italian campaign. How in God's name did they know we were coming? Now, pull back from the blood-soaked sand of Salerno. Travel miles out to sea, to the sterile, steel-gray world of the USS Ancon, flagship of the invasion fleet. Here, the war is not a visceral scream, it's a series of whispers, the rustle of paper, and the quiet crackle of radio static. General Mark Clark, commander of the American Fifth Army, stands over a map table illuminated by a single hooded lamp. He's a tall, imposing figure, radiating an almost painful degree of self-confidence. For Clark and his staff, the reports flooding in from the beachhead are like shards of glass in a finely tuned engine. They don't make sense. The official explanation was born here, in this quiet, air-conditioned room. It was a masterpiece of military logic, built on one central, unshakable assumption that the German war machine in Italy was now decapitated. Just the day before, on September 8th, the Allies had announced Italy's unconditional surrender. Imagine you're the CEO of a massive corporation, and your primary partner, the one who owns half the factories and employs half the workers, suddenly declares bankruptcy and walks out the door. The expected result is chaos, paralysis, disorganization. Allied intelligence predicted that Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, would be caught completely flat-footed, scrambling to disarm his former allies, while simultaneously trying to pull his own forces back north, away from the Allied sledgehammer. So, the reports of such ferocious, coordinated resistance at Salerno were initially filtered through this lens of comforting logic. It's a local commander, one staff officer would have suggested, a die-hard Nazi exceeding his orders. Another would nod, adding, they've scraped together a battle group from spare parts. It's a crust, General. A hard crust, but once we break through it, they'll shatter. Every piece of contradictory information was explained away. The pinpoint artillery? Lucky ranging shots. The machine gun emplacements? Haphazardly thrown together. The plan, their beautiful plan, could not be wrong. It was simply encountering a pocket of unexpectedly stubborn friction. The system was trying to put the terrifying anomaly of the Salerno beach into a box it could understand and dismiss. Then, the first piece of hard, undeniable truth came out of the chaos. It didn't come from a high-level decrypt or an aerial photograph. It came from the mud and the blood, in the form of the first German prisoners. A haggard platoon leader from the Texas Division, his face smeared with grime and his uniform torn, had dragged 3 captured Germans to a field interrogation post just behind the dunes. A young intelligence lieutenant, barely out of college, began the questioning. He expected to hear the unit designation of a coastal defense division or a disorganized garrison force. Instead, the German NCO, defiant even in capture, spat out his unit's 16th Panzer Division. The name hit the intelligence officer's desk back on the Ancon like a physical blow. The 16th Panzer. Not a second-rate unit. Not a collection of old men and boys. This was a premier armored division, veterans of the slaughterhouse at Stalingrad, pulled from the Eastern Front to refit. According to the Allies' own intelligence, the 16th Panzer was supposed to be resting, licking its wounds, hundreds of miles away. It had absolutely no business being here. And it wasn't just a few tanks. The prisoners confirmed the entire division was dug into the hills overlooking the bay. They had maps. They had pre-sighted artillery coordinates for every square meter of that beach. They hadn't been surprised. They had been waiting. In that single, sickening moment, the official explanation evaporated. The comforting story High Command had told itself of a confused enemy in panicked retreat was revealed to be a complete fiction. This wasn't a hard crust. It was a purpose-built anvil, placed with chilling precision, waiting for the hammer of Operation Avalanche to fall. Kesselring wasn't panicking. He was hunting. The revelation turned the confident hum of the command ship into a tomb. The question was no longer how they would break through the German defenses. The new question, the one that made the blood run cold, was infinitely worse. If our entire intelligence estimate of the enemy's position and intention is this catastrophically wrong, what other traps has he set for us? The presence of the 16th Panzer Division at Salerno wasn't just a tactical problem, it was a strategic nightmare that threatened to unravel the entire Allied position in the Mediterranean. To understand why this one piece of information sent a shockwave all the way back to Eisenhower's headquarters, you have to understand the brutal physics of an amphibious invasion. Let's do a quick war college briefing. Imagine you're a rock climber, attempting to scale a sheer cliff face. Your entire life depends on the first few metal spikes, the pitons, that you hammer into the rock. These first anchor points are your beachhead. They have to be strong, secure, and established quickly. For the first few hours, maybe even days, you are incredibly vulnerable. You are clinging to the cliff by your fingertips. Most of your strength, your army, is still down below, in the boats, waiting to climb up the ropes you've secured. Your enemy isn't hanging on by a thread. He's standing on the top of the cliff, with a firm footing, able to drop rocks on your head at his leisure. That was the Allied situation at Salerno. The Fifth Army was the climber, desperately trying to hammer in its pitons on a narrow strip of sand. The bulk of its armor, its artillery, its supplies, its very lifeblood, was still floating in the Gulf. This initial phase of an invasion is what military planners call the lodgment phase. It is the moment of maximum vulnerability. The invading army is caught between the sea and the enemy, with no room to maneuver. Its back literally to the water. The whole point of choosing a landing site is to find a spot where the enemy is weak, where you can establish that lodgment before he can react. The Allies had chosen Salerno for a very specific reason. It was the northernmost point they could reach while still under the protective umbrella of their fighter planes flying from newly captured airfields in Sicily. It was a calculated risk. But the entire calculation was based on the official story that German forces were in disarray. The plan was to get ashore, consolidate, and then make a swift dash for the port of Naples and the crucial Foggia airfields, the real strategic prizes of the campaign. The sudden appearance of the 16th Panzer turned this calculation on its head. Kesselring hadn't been fooled. He had read the strategic map as well as the Allies had. He knew they needed a major port. He knew the range of their fighter cover. He looked at the map of Italy, and with a cold, clear logic, he deduced the most probable landing sites. And then, instead of scattering his forces, he did something brilliant and utterly ruthless. He used the Italian surrender not as a crisis, but as a mask. While Allied intelligence was confidently predicting his retreat, he was quietly moving his best troops, his fire brigades, like the 16th Panzer, into perfect overwatch positions above the likely invasion beaches. This is what raised the stakes from a bloody battle to a potential catastrophe. The 16th Panzer wasn't there just to fight, it was there to execute a doctrine the Germans had perfected to counterattack at the water's edge. The goal wasn't to defeat the invasion force over weeks. The goal was to annihilate it in a matter of hours. To drive it back into the sea before its pitons were secure, before it could bring its full strength to bear. It was a plan to turn Salerno into a second, and far deadlier, Dieppe. Suddenly, every rifleman clinging to a sand dune, every tank trying to navigate a minefield, every supply ship waiting to unload, was part of a desperate race against time. The mystery of the German preparations was no longer an intelligence puzzle to be solved later. It was an existential threat. If Clark's Fifth Army couldn't break out of the beachhead, and fast, Kesselring would gather his other armored divisions and deliver a death blow. They wouldn't just lose the battle, they would lose the entire army. The mission, therefore, became brutally simple. It was no longer about a glorious march to Naples. It was about survival. An urgent, desperate order was given, an order that had nothing to do with grand strategy and everything to do with brute force. Find the seams. Find the weak points. Push inland, no matter the cost. They had to widen the beachhead, to give themselves room to breathe, to land the tanks and guns they needed to face the panzers. They had to get off the beach, or die there. The investigation into how the Germans knew was put on hold. The only thing that mattered now was fighting their way out of the trap that had been so perfectly laid. War is a business of inches. After the grand, strategic catastrophe on the beaches, the fight for Italy devolved into 1,000 small, vicious battles for a single stone wall, a dusty road, a sun-baked olive grove. For days, the men of the Fifth Army bled for every yard they gained, pushing inland from Salerno into the flat, marshy plain of the Seal River. The air was a constant haze of dust and cordite. This was not a war of movement, it was a methodical, grinding affair, like trying to push a mountain with your bare hands. The initial mystery of the German foresight had been buried under the immediate, brutal necessity of staying alive. Our scene shifts to the outskirts of Battipaglia, a town that on any map looked insignificant, but had become a vortex of destruction. Here, the key terrain wasn't a hill or a bridge, but a series of large, stone-built tobacco factories. Their thick walls, designed to cure tobacco leaves, were now perfect miniature fortresses. A company of rangers, men who specialized in this kind of close, savage work, were tasked with clearing one of these factories. For 2 days, the fight had been room to room, a nightmare of ricocheting bullets, grenade blasts in enclosed spaces, and the acrid smell of burning tobacco mixed with blood. Inside the factory manager's office, a young lieutenant named James McHale finally cornered the last of the defenders. A German officer, a Hauptmann with the Iron Cross pinned to his tunic, fought with the cold fury of a man who knew he was doomed. McHale shot him as he was reaching for a fresh magazine. The fight was over. As his men secured the room, McHale, exhausted and trembling with adrenaline, noticed a heavy leather map case still clutched in the dead officer's hand. He pried it open. This was the first real clue. It wasn't a codebook or a top-secret operational plan. It was something far more mundane and far more revealing, a standard-issue German military map. McHale sent it back to the divisional command post, where it landed on the cluttered desk of a captain in G2 intelligence, a former architect named David Ryland. Ryland's job was to turn the chaos of the battlefield into a coherent picture, a task that had so far been impossible. He smoothed the captured map out under a flickering lantern. At first, it looked ordinary. It showed the Salerno plain, the Seal River, the town of Battipaglia. But then Ryland saw the pencil marks. A series of thin, red lines, drawn with a precise, confident hand, snaked across the terrain north of their current position. They followed the contours of hills, the banks of rivers, the paths of mountain roads. They were labeled with cryptic notations: Victor Line, Barbara Line, and further north, drawn more heavily, was a formidable-looking barrier labeled simply Gustav Line. This wasn't a tactical map for the defense of Salerno. This was a road map for a retreat. But it was a retreat of a kind the Allies hadn't conceived of. It wasn't a panicked scramble north. It was a perfectly choreographed, phased withdrawal. Each red line represented a new line of defense, a new kill zone, already surveyed, already fortified, waiting for them. The Germans weren't just fighting here, on this piece of ground. They were luring the Allies forward, channeling them into the next pre-prepared meat grinder. For Captain Ryland, looking at those red lines, it was a moment of profound, chilling clarity. A wave of intellectual excitement, the first glimmer of hope in days, washed over him. The enemy wasn't just a chaotic force of nature. He was a brilliant, methodical engineer of death. He had a plan, and for the first time, they were holding a page from his playbook. They could finally stop reacting and start predicting. The mystery of Salerno wasn't an isolated event, it was the opening move in a much larger, more terrifying game. This map was the key. He felt a surge of optimism. They had found the Germans' secret. They understood the strategy. But as he traced the lines with his finger, following them north past Naples, into the jagged spine of the Apennine Mountains, the hope began to curdle into a new kind of dread. The lines didn't stop. They just kept going, one after another, all the way up the map until they disappeared off the edge of the paper. He had found the first clue, but it didn't point to a quick victory. It pointed to a question that would haunt the entire Allied command: just how many of these kill zones had they prepared? The discovery of the German defensive map, with its chillingly methodical red lines, created a palpable sense of excitement at Fifth Army headquarters. Finally, they weren't blind. They had a blueprint for the enemy's intentions. The prevailing theory, born from this newfound optimism, was that these lines, the Victor, the Barbara, were delaying positions. Conventional military wisdom dictated that an army in retreat fought to buy time. They'd force the Allies to deploy, fight a bloody battle for a river or a ridge, and then, just as the Allies were about to achieve a breakthrough, they'd slip away in the night to the next pre-prepared line. It was a frustrating strategy, but a logical one. The German goal, it was assumed, was to slow the Allied advance, to make it costly, while the bulk of their forces continued their strategic withdrawal to the north, perhaps to the Alps. This theory, clean and logical, guided the next phase of the Allied attack. After finally breaking out of the Salerno beachhead and capturing Naples, the Fifth Army began its grueling push north. They were now the hunters, armed with the enemy's own map. They knew where the next fight would be. They could plan for it, mass artillery, and use their superior air power to pound the German positions. The first of these, the Volturno line, was a brutal fight, but it fell more or less according to the new script. The Germans defended it tenaciously, inflicted casualties, and then retreated to the next line. The Allied commanders nodded. The theory held. The German was a cunning opponent, but a predictable one. Then they reached the Barbara Line, a series of fortified hills in the heart of the Apennine Mountains. And here, the promising lead, the beautiful, logical theory, slammed into a wall of granite and German ingenuity. This is where they met the true genius of Albert Kesselring. He wasn't just building lines of defense. He was using the terrain of Italy itself as a weapon. Captain Ryland, the intelligence officer, was among the first to realize their fundamental misunderstanding. He was studying aerial reconnaissance photos of the Mignano Gap, a narrow pass that was the key to unlocking the Barbara Line. On the map, it was a simple objective. On the photos, it was a death trap. Every mountain overlooking the pass Monte Camino, Monte La Difensa, Monte Maggiore had been transformed into an artillery fortress. These weren't just trenches. The Germans had used engineering battalions, drilling directly into the rock, to create gun positions that were impervious to bombing. They had clear, interlocking fields of fire that could turn the valley floor into a perfectly calibrated killing field. But the true genius was in the mud. Autumn had arrived, and with it came the rain. Not just showers, but relentless, biblical downpours that turned the valleys into swamps and the roads into impassable rivers of mud. Kesselring's engineers hadn't just fortified the hills, they had systematically destroyed every culvert, every bridge, and every drainage ditch in the valleys. They had, in effect, weaponized the weather. The Allied advantage in tanks and motorized infantry, the very core of their doctrine, was completely neutralized. Their Shermans and half-tracks bogged down in the mud, becoming easy targets for the high-angle guns firing from the mountains above. Suddenly, the Allied commanders were faced with a horrifying realization. Their map, their prized clue, wasn't a road map to victory. It was a lure. Kesselring wasn't just delaying them. He was channeling them. He was deliberately leaving the valleys open, knowing the Allies would follow the roads, and then trapping them in the mud while his forces, high and dry in their mountain fortresses, bled them white. The simple theory of a phased withdrawal collapsed. This wasn't a retreat. It was a masterpiece of defensive warfare, a perfectly integrated system of terrain, weather, and firepower designed to inflict maximum casualties for minimum cost. They were no longer the hunters. They were flies that had been expertly guided into a spider's web. The optimism that had followed the discovery of the map curdled into a grim, soul-crushing reality. They weren't just fighting the German army. They were fighting the mountains. They were fighting the rain. They were fighting a defensive system so formidable, so intelligently designed, that every step forward cost a river of blood. And the most terrifying part was that this, the Barbara Line, was only a preliminary defense. The big one, the Gustav Line, was still waiting for them. The winter of 1943 was a season of despair. The Italian campaign, once billed as a swift march to Rome, had degenerated into a static, bloody stalemate south of the Gustav Line. It was a war of attrition that resembled the Western Front of 1916, a hell of mud, misery, and shattered bodies. The Allied armies were exhausted, their morale sinking with every failed frontal assault against the German mountain fortresses. They were trapped in Kesselring's web, and every attempt to break free only seemed to tighten its grip. High command was desperate. The old ways, the brute force of artillery and infantry, were failing at an unacceptable cost. They needed a new way to see the battlefield, a key to unlock the German puzzle. The breakthrough didn't come from a general's brilliant maneuver or a spy's daring mission. It came from a quiet room, far from the front, a place that smelled of ozone and hot vacuum tubes. It came from a piece of technology so new, so revolutionary, that most commanders barely understood its potential: photographic reconnaissance intelligence, or photoint. Specifically, it came from a handful of specially modified P-38 Lightning fighters, stripped of their guns and packed with high-resolution cameras. These were the eyes of the army, flown by pilots with nerves of steel who raced over enemy territory at treetop level, their cameras clicking, capturing God's-eye views of Kesselring's fortress. Day after day, these pilots brought back canisters of film. And in a converted villa near Caserta, a team of analysts, academics, artists, and architects in uniform would pin the wet prints onto massive boards, creating a mosaic of the enemy's world. For weeks, they stared at these images, searching for a weakness in the formidable Gustav Line. They saw the concrete bunkers, the machine gun nests, the tangled barbed wire, the minefields. It all looked impregnable. Then, a young analyst, a former archaeology student from Yale, noticed something. He was looking at a series of photos taken of the Liri Valley, the main corridor to Rome, which was blocked by the fortress town of Cassino. He wasn't looking at the fortifications. He was looking at the ground between them. He saw faint tracks in the mud, strange patterns of disturbed earth, places where the winter grass was a slightly different color. To a soldier, it was nothing. To an archaeologist trained to spot the outlines of buried Roman villas from the air, it was a language. He called over his superior. He pointed to a series of seemingly random smudges and lines running behind the main German fighting positions. "These aren't supply tracks," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "Look at the pattern. They're too deliberate. They connect gun positions to command posts to ammo dumps." He grabbed another photo from a different sector. "And look, it's the same here." What he had discovered was the enemy's nervous system. Buried just a few feet beneath the mud was an elaborate, hardened network of telephone cables. This was how the Germans were achieving their almost supernatural coordination. This was why their artillery was so devastatingly fast and accurate. A forward observer on a mountain peak would spot an Allied tank, whisper a coordinate into a field telephone, and seconds later, shells would rain down from a dozen different hidden gun positions miles away, all firing in perfect unison. They weren't just defending a line, they were operating a single, integrated killing machine, and these buried cables were the synapses connecting the brain to the trigger finger. The Allied bombers had been targeting the obvious, the bunkers, the bridges, the guns. But they were only striking the limbs. The photo analyst from Yale had just found the spinal cord. This discovery was a seismic shock. It revealed a new, more dangerous path forward. They couldn't go through the Gustav line. They couldn't go over it. But maybe, just maybe, they could sever its connections. They could blind the beast. An audacious, high-risk plan began to form, a plan that wouldn't rely on infantry or tanks, but on a new kind of soldier, the saboteur. The mission would be to drop small teams of men deep behind the Gustav line, armed with these photographs and wire cutters, to systematically cut Kesselring's communications just before the next major offensive. It was a ghost mission, a silent attack on the invisible architecture of the German defense. And it was their only hope. The discovery of the German communication network was more than a tactical breakthrough, it was the key that finally unlocked the entire strategic puzzle of the Italian campaign. Back in the sterile quiet of the G2 intelligence section, Captain Ryland and his team worked feverishly, combining the new photo reconnaissance data with captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and radio intercepts. As they pieced it all together, a new, deeply uncomfortable picture of their enemy began to emerge. And with it came a truth that was strategically brilliant, militarily vital, and politically toxic. For months, the Allied narrative, pushed by commanders like Mark Clark and trumpeted in the press back home, was one of steady, grinding progress against a desperate, retreating foe. Every river crossed, every mountain taken was framed as another step in the inevitable Allied victory march. The horrific casualty rates were explained away as the necessary price for pushing the tenacious German back. But the evidence laid out on Ryland's map table told a completely different story. Kesselring wasn't retreating. He wasn't desperately trying to get his men back to Germany. He was doing something far more cunning, something the Allies, with their doctrine of overwhelming force and rapid advance, had failed to comprehend. He was conducting a fighting withdrawal to prepared positions, a textbook German doctrine, but executed on a scale and with a level of engineering genius never seen before. He wasn't trying to win in Italy. He was using Italy as a tool. Let's have another War College briefing. Think of the entire Allied war effort in Europe as a powerful fire hose. The main nozzle is pointed at Normandy for the eventual D-Day landings. That's the decisive theater. But in 1943, that nozzle isn't ready yet. So, you have this incredible pressure built up in the hose, millions of men, tens of thousands of tanks and planes. What Kesselring had been ordered to do by Hitler was simple: open a small, secondary valve on that hose in Italy, lure the Allies in, and then make closing that valve so agonizingly, bloodily difficult that the Allies would be forced to divert more and more pressure, more and more resources, away from the main effort in France. Every mountain fortress, every river line, every machine gun mule path was not an end in itself. It was a mechanism for bleeding the Allies. The German objective wasn't to hold ground, it was to inflict a precise, calculated number of casualties for every yard the Allies gained. The buried telephone lines, the interlocking fields of fire, the weaponized weather, it was all part of a monstrously efficient equation of attrition. Kesselring was turning the entire Italian peninsula into a strategic anvil, designed to hold the Allied armies in place and allow German hammers to smash them, to drain their strength, manpower, and supplies that were desperately needed for the Normandy invasion. This was the uncomfortable truth. The Allies weren't winning a slow, heroic advance. They were losing a war of attrition, fighting on ground of the enemy's choosing, on the enemy's terms. They were the bull, repeatedly charging the matador's cape, exhausting themselves while the real fight was meant to be elsewhere. The casualty reports pouring in from the Gustav Line, thousands of men lost for a few hundred yards of useless rock, were no longer just tragic statistics. They were proof that Kesselring's strategy was working perfectly. This revelation was a political bombshell. How could the generals tell their political masters in London and Washington that the entire Italian campaign, sold as a strategic masterstroke, had become a massive, resource-draining sidetrack? How could they admit that the enemy they portrayed as being on the ropes was in fact dictating the pace and nature of the entire conflict? To acknowledge the truth of Kesselring's strategy would be to admit their own strategic blunder. It would mean telling grieving families back home that their sons were dying not to liberate Rome, but to serve as bloody bait in a German strategic trap. The truth was simply too damaging, too contradictory to the established narrative of victory. It challenged the very wisdom of the men running the war. Captain Ryland and his G2 team compiled their findings into a stark, meticulously detailed intelligence assessment. It concluded that Field Marshal Kesselring was not engaged in a desperate defense, but was, in fact, conducting one of the most masterful defensive campaigns in modern military history. Its recommendation was radical: a complete strategic pause to rethink the offensive. It suggested that continuing to throw men against the Gustav Line was not just costly, it was actively playing into the enemy's hands. The report was sent up the chain of command, landing with a thud on the polished desk of a staff colonel in General Clark's 5th Army headquarters. Days later, Ryland was summoned. He entered an office that felt cold, despite the potbelly stove glowing in the corner. The colonel, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a mask of impatient certainty, didn't ask him to sit. He held Ryland's report by the corner, as if it were a contaminated object. "Captain," the colonel began, his voice flat and hard. "I've read your analysis. It's very well written, very academic." He let the word academic hang in the air, turning it into an insult. "But it's also dangerously pessimistic." "Sir," Ryland started, "the evidence is conclusive. Kesselring is trading space for time and casualties. He's bleeding us on his own terms. We're falling into a strategic trap." The colonel tossed the report onto his desk. "What you call a trap, Captain, I call a fight. We have an enemy in front of us. Our job is to destroy him. Your job is to tell me where he is weak, not to question the entire goddamn strategy." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Are you telling me a Texas infantryman doesn't have the stomach to take a hill? Is that the official assessment of G2 now? That our men can't do the job? Of course not, sir. It's not about the quality of our soldiers. It's about the soundness of the plan. They can take any hill. But the question is, at what cost and to what end? We're fighting his battle, not ours." "That's enough," the colonel snapped, his face flushed with anger. "You analysts in the rear, you get lost in your maps and your theories. You forget that this war is won by will, by relentless pressure. General Clark is determined to take Rome, and we are going to give him the intelligence to do it. The German is stubborn, but he's brittle. We hit him hard enough, he will break." He picked up a pen and scrawled across the cover of Ryland's report. "Your assessment fails to account for the superior morale and fighting quality of the Allied soldier. Focus solely on providing tactical intelligence for the next attack." It was a direct, unambiguous order. The system wasn't interested in a key to unlock the door, it was determined to simply knock the whole wall down. The debate was over. The system had protected itself. The official, fatally flawed reality had won. The system had silenced the truth. And now, The men at Anzio and Cassino would pay the price for its arrogance. This is the moment the gears of tragedy lock into place. This is the lowest point, where the crushing weight of the system smothers the spark of truth. For Captain Ryland and his small team, the order was a profound moral and intellectual defeat. Transferred from the strategic analysis section, Ryland was reassigned to a mind-numbing logistical role, counting crates of K-rations and spare tires a quiet, bureaucratic punishment for the crime of being right when the powerful were wrong. His team was broken up, its members scattered to different units, their collective insight dissipated like smoke. They were forced to watch from the sidelines, armed with the terrible certainty of what was about to happen, but rendered powerless to stop it. And so, the disaster they tried to prevent was set in motion irrevocably. In January 1944, the Allies launched Operation Shingle, the amphibious landing at Anzio. It was a bold plan on paper, designed to bypass the Gustav Line and land a massive force behind the Germans. It was supposed to be the key that finally unlocked Rome. But the execution was crippled by the very mindset that had rejected Ryland's analysis. The ghost of Salerno still haunted the Allied command. Fearing another counterattack at the water's edge, the commander at Anzio, General John Lucas, was overly cautious. Instead of immediately dashing inland to seize the high ground as planned, he hesitated. He spent critical days digging in, building up a massive stockpile of supplies. He was fighting the last battle instead of the current one. This fatal hesitation gave Kesselring the one thing his strategy depended on: time. The fireman, as his troops called him, reacted with astonishing speed. While High Command was still congratulating itself, Kesselring was already pulling divisions from the north, from France, even from the Gustav Line itself, and racing them towards Anzio. He understood instantly that the Anzio beachhead was not a threat, it was a gift. The Allies had willingly placed their heads into a second noose. The result was a catastrophe. Instead of outflanking the Gustav Line, the Anzio force found itself trapped in a small, flat, waterlogged beachhead, surrounded on all sides by German artillery placed on the overlooking Alban Hills. The situation became a mirror image of Salerno, but infinitely worse. It was a static siege, a shooting gallery where Allied soldiers were shelled, bombed, and sniped relentlessly for 4 agonizing months. Anzio, the great flanking maneuver, became what the troops grimly called the largest self-supporting POW camp in the world. For the men still fighting at the Gustav Line, the failure at Anzio was a death sentence. Instead of the pressure being relieved, it was intensified. They were now ordered to launch even more desperate, suicidal frontal assaults on Cassino to try and break through to relieve the trapped army. The two fronts, which were meant to support each other, were now locked in a symbiotic death struggle, bleeding each other white. The great plan to avoid the meat grinder had only succeeded in creating a second, even more efficient one. The unfolding catastrophe became the defining experience of a generation of soldiers. To understand it, you must leave the headquarters and go back to the mud, to the rock, to the crucible of Cassino. It's February 1944. The rain hasn't stopped for weeks. You are with the 2nd New Zealand Division, part of a multinational force of Americans, British, French, Indians, and Poles who have been thrown, wave after wave, against the same unbreakable wall of German defenses. The name Cassino is no longer a place on a map. It's a synonym for hell. From your trench, you look up. The entire world is dominated by a single feature: the ancient Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino, perched atop a mountain like a stone god, looking down on the entire Leary Valley. To the soldiers below, the abbey became an obsession. It was the symbol of their failure, a silent, omniscient spectator to their slaughter. Though there was no concrete evidence the Germans were using it as an observation post, in fact, Kesselring had ordered them not to. It didn't matter. In the paranoid logic of trench warfare, the abbey had to be the source of their misery. It was the evil eye that directed the impossibly accurate shellfire that tore their platoons apart. This is the dramatic irony that haunts this part of the story. While the soldiers on the ground were convinced the abbey was the brain of the German defense, we know the true brain was the buried network of telephone cables. The generals, having dismissed that intelligence, were now as blind as their men. Desperate for a breakthrough and besieged by the psychological terror the abbey represented, they made a fateful decision. They fell for the symbol. They decided to bomb the abbey. On the morning of February 15th, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses appeared in the winter sky. For hours, they dropped wave after wave of high-explosive bombs onto the 600-year-old monastery. The magnificent structure, a treasure of Western civilization, was systematically pulverized into a mountain of rubble. It was a spectacular, terrifying display of Allied air power. And it was one of the greatest tactical blunders of the entire war. The bombing accomplished nothing of military value. It didn't kill a single German soldier inside the abbey, because there were none. But what it did do was transform the site. Before, it was a fragile historic building. After the bombing, it was a mountain of shattered stone, broken walls, and deep, fortified cellars, the single greatest fortress in all of Italy. The German paratroopers of the elite 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, the best soldiers Kesselring had, immediately moved into the ruins. They burrowed into the rubble, creating a warren of machine gun nests and mortar pits that were perfectly camouflaged and all but invulnerable to artillery. The Allies hadn't destroyed an observation post, they had created a perfect killing ground and handed it to the enemy's best troops. The ensuing battle for the ruins was a vision of the apocalypse. Men fought with bayonets and flamethrowers in the crypts of ancient saints. They died in the rubble of the library that had once held irreplaceable manuscripts. And far from the front, in an office filled with shipping manifests, Captain Ryland could only read the casualty reports and know that every name on the list was a consequence of a warning that had gone unheard. The Allied High Command, by ignoring the real, invisible nature of the German defense and focusing on its powerful symbol, had managed to make an impregnable position even deadlier. They had poured gasoline on a fire, and the men of a dozen nations were the ones who got burned. Jump forward. The war is over. The great armies have gone home, leaving behind a scarred landscape and quiet acres of white crosses. The grand narrative of the war is being written, a story of heroic advances and inevitable victory. The brutal, grinding truth of the Italian campaign, with its catastrophic casualties and strategic stalemates, is smoothed over, becoming a footnote in the larger epic of Normandy and the fall of Berlin. The uncomfortable questions are buried in archives, locked away in files stamped top secret. Our scene is now a dusty university library in the early 1970s. A young, determined historian is poring over a newly declassified set of documents, the Fifth Army G2 intelligence assessments from the winter of 1943 to 44. For years, the official story of Cassino and Anzio has held sway, a story of a tenacious enemy, difficult terrain, and the unfortunate but necessary costs of war. But here, on brittle, yellowing paper, is the ghost of the truth. The historian finds the report compiled by Captain David Ryland's team. He reads the cool, analytical prose describing Kesselring's attritional strategy. He sees the prescient warnings about the futility of frontal assaults, the clear-eyed assessment of the German defensive genius. He then finds the dismissive comments scribbled in the margins by the senior staff officers, the accusations of pessimism, the stubborn refusal to see what the evidence so clearly showed. And then he finds the official order, reassigning Ryland and dissolving his team. In that quiet library, decades after the fact, the fog of war finally lifts. This single file, gathering dust for a quarter of a century, is the vindication. It is the declassified proof that a handful of men had seen the truth, had understood the enemy's entire design, and had tried to warn a system that was deaf to anything but its own optimistic illusions. The bombing of the Abbey, the slaughter at the Rapido River, the 4-month agony of Anzio, none of it was simply a tragic consequence of war's chaos. It was the direct, predictable result of a specific, documented failure, the failure of high command to listen. Years later, another piece of the puzzle falls into place. An old man, once a Hauptmann in the German 10th Army, is interviewed for a military journal. He is asked how they managed to hold on for so long against such overwhelming Allied superiority in men and material. The old German veteran doesn't speak of fanaticism or miracle weapons. He smiles a thin, weary smile and says, "We had their playbook." He explains that the Allies were so predictable. They would mass their forces, pound a position with artillery for days, and then attack along the most obvious axis. All we had to do, the veteran says, was wait for the noise to stop and then man the guns. Your generals were very methodical. He confirms everything Ryland's report had argued. The Germans weren't just reacting. They were actively exploiting the rigid, unimaginative doctrine of their opponents. They knew the Allies would choose the valleys, they knew they would rely on their tanks, and they knew they would eventually try to smash their way through the strongest part of the line. Kesselring's strategy was not just a defense of Italy, it was a brilliant and brutal psychological manipulation of his enemy's command structure. He wasn't just fighting an army, he was fighting a mindset. And he was winning. So now, let's step back into this quiet archive room one last time. Let's take all the pieces: the blood on the Salerno sand, the captured map with its red lines, the ghostly images from the spy planes, the rejected report, the rubble of the abbey, and the old soldier's testimony, and lay them out on the table. Only now, with the fog completely lifted, can we see the beautiful, terrible clarity of it all. The Italian campaign was never about the soft underbelly of Europe. That was a fantasy. The real story, the one buried in the declassified files, is the story of a classroom. The ultimate war college briefing. Italy was the place where the brute force of the industrial Allied war machine came up against the intellectual and engineering genius of the German defensive doctrine. And for almost 2 years, the student failed the exam again and again. Think of it like this: the Allies came to Italy to fight a boxing match. They had the bigger muscles, the heavier punch, the greater stamina. They believed they could win by knockout. But Albert Kesselring wasn't a boxer. He was a master of judo. He met their force not with opposing force, but by redirecting it. He used their momentum against them. He yielded ground, not in weakness, but to lure them off balance. He turned their greatest strengths, their superiority in tanks and aircraft, into weaknesses by channeling them into the mud and mountains where they were useless. He absorbed every powerful blow on a different part of his body: the Victor line, the Barbara line, the Gustav line, until the mighty boxer was exhausted, bleeding from 1,000 small cuts, and ready to collapse. Every mystery we encountered along the way is now solved. The Germans knew about Salerno because Kesselring was a master strategist who could read a map and anticipate his enemy's most logical move. The defensive lines weren't a sign of weakness, but the framework of a massive, peninsula-wide killing machine designed to trade space for blood. The brutal stalemate at Cassino wasn't an accident, it was the intended, engineered outcome of that machine working at peak efficiency. And the failure of the Allied command wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a profound intellectual failure, a refusal to believe that the enemy could be smarter, more adaptable, and fighting a completely different kind of war. The ultimate echo of the Italian campaign is a timeless lesson about the nature of war itself. It teaches us that battles are won not just by firepower, but by imagination. It warns us about the seductive danger of the official story, the comfortable narrative that reassures commanders but blinds them to the brutal ground truth. It reminds us that the most important weapon in any conflict is the ability to understand the mind of your enemy, and that the greatest vulnerability is the inability to question your own assumptions. The tragedy of Italy is the story of an army that had all the answers, but refused, until it was far too late, to ask the right questions. And the cost of that lesson was paid in the currency of soldiers' lives, buried in the soil of a country that was never, for one single moment, soft.